Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around, Ghoulcaller Gisa. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as a list price, it doesn't include costs such as shipping. So, Ghoulcaller Gisa is a 3/4 mono black legendary human wizard costing 3 generic and 2 black to cast, with an activated ability costing 1 black and tapping Gisa to sack another creature and make X 2/2 black zombie creature tokens, with X being that sacked creature's power. Which, to me, has a pretty straightforward build path. We'll first look to include a bunch of creatures that have relatively low converted mana cost compared to their power, which black, and colorless, have a fairly decent spread of options for, though usually with some negative effects stapled onto them. But that shouldn't be a major issue, as often we'll be sacking those creatures to make zombies in the go wide strategy. We'll also have a handful of small creatures that can grow rather quickly in this deck, typically through creatures entering the battlefield under our control, and a handful of less represented but still useful effects like reanimation. But let's not dither around too much and get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. I'll start with Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can sack to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and then we have Prismatic Lens, Mind Stone, the Iron Crag, and Thought Vessel as 2-drop mana rocks, tapping for generic. Thought Vessel also giving you no max hand size. Charcoal Diamond and Leaden Mirror are 2 drops to tap for black, but won't be regularly accessible on the turn that you cast them. But to round this section out, we have Felwar Stone, which is likely to tap for black in a given commander game, and Arcane Signet, which will tap for black mana. But now let's move on to our rather high-powered creatures that we'll use to fuel our zombie army. First up is Aegon, God of Death, a 3 CMC 6/6 with Death Touch that requires that you exile 2 cards from your graveyard on your upkeep to keep it around. Though on the flip side is Throne of Death, which has you mill 1 on your upkeep, and lets you exile a creature from your graveyard to draw a card, useful if you need the draw instead of the zombie source at that given time. Hunted Bone Brood is a 3 mana 6/2 with Menace that gives a target opponent 2 1/1 dogs when it enters the battlefield, but has each opponent lose 3 life when it dies. Phyrexian Soulgorger is a 3-drop 8/8 with a cumulative upkeep of sacking a creature, so depending on how many zombie tokens you have, you may want to or could keep it on the battlefield for a few turns with moderately low loss. And our last 3-drop is the Rotting Regisaur, a 7/6 that has you discard a card on your upkeep. For 4 mana creatures, I'll start with the Demon of Catastrophes, a 6/6 with Flying and Trample that has you sack a creature when it enters the battlefield. Traxos, Scourge of Krug, is a 7/7 Trampler, though it enters the battlefield tapped and only untaps when you cast a Historic, so Artifact Legendary Saga, spell. Abyssal Persecutor is a 6/6 with Flying and Trample, though when it's on the board you can't win, and your opponents can't lose the game. Desecration Demon is a 6/6 flyer that, during each combat, an opponent can sack a creature to tap Desecration Demon and put a +1/+1 counter on it, which could be a pain if we weren't mostly intending to sack this. Desecration Elemental is an 8/8 with Fear, though we'll probably want to get this sacked fairly quickly, as it has a sack a creature whenever a player casts a spell. And then there's Ebon Death Dracolich, a 5/2 with Flash and Flying that enters the battlefield tapped, but we can cast it from our graveyard provided a creature not named Ebon Death Dracolich had died that turn, so some built-in recursion that should be quite easy to access. Then for 5 mana we have Yargle, Glutton of Urborg, a vanilla 9/3. And then skipping 6 and on to 7, we have Scourge of Nel Toth, a 6/6 with Flying, but we can cast it from our graveyard for 2 black mana and sacking 2 creatures, so once we get it into the yard, and with a few zombie tokens on the field, we'll have pretty easy access to a readily sackable 6/6. And then we have Ancient Stone Idol, a 12/12 Trampler with Flash for 10, but it costs 1 less to cast for each attacking creature, and we have a go wide strategy, so we'll rarely be paying much mana at all to cast this. And additionally, when it dies, we make a 6/12 colorless construct artifact creature token with Trample. So even without recursion in mind, this card can make up to 18 zombies for us, while also being a scary swinger if we keep it around for a while. Then for somewhat different creatures, Soulless One is a 4-drop zombie avatar that has power and toughness equal to the number of zombies in play, plus the number of zombie cards in all graveyards. Champion of the Perished is a 1/1 zombie for 1 that gets a +1/+1 counter put on it whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control. Bloodline Pretender is a 2/2 shapeshifter with Changeling, so it has all creature types, that has you choose a creature type upon it entering, so zombie for us, and whenever another creature of that type enters under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on Bloodline Pretender. And finally for this section, Fell Beast of Mordor is a 3/3 with Flying and Devour 1, where, as it enters the battlefield, you can sack any number of creatures, and Fell Beast enters with that many +1/+1 counters on it. And then when it enters the battlefield or attacks, a target opponent loses X life and you gain X life, with X being the number of those counters on Fell Beast of Mordor. Now I'd like to move on to a handful of effects that are useful in this deck, but aren't represented enough to really afford their own chapters. Starting with reanimation effects, we have Ghoulcaller's Chant, which for 1 black mana, lets us either return any 1 target creature from our graveyard to our hand, or 2 zombie creature cards from our graveyard to our hand. Then Victimize, having you choose 2 creature cards in your graveyard, and then you sack a creature, where you can then return those chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. And Dread Return, which simply returns a target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, though it also has Flashback, letting us recast this spell from our graveyard by sacking 3 creatures. And then we have Undying Malice and Not Dead After All, which are 1-drop instant spells giving a target creature until the end of the turn. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. And for the former, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and for the latter, it gets a Wicked Roll token attached to it. So it gets +1/+1, and when that aura enters the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. So these could be useful to bring back a creature we're sacking with Gisa, or could be used as a way to protect Gisa from our opponent's interaction. Moving away from those types of effects though, we have Mirkwood Bats, which is a 2/3 flyer that has each opponent lose 1 life whenever we create or sack a token. And finally, we have a few zombie anthems with Cemetery Reaper and Lord of the Accursed, giving other zombies you control +1/+1, the former also being a bit of graveyard hate, letting you exile a creature card from a graveyard to make a 2/2 zombie creature token, and the latter giving you a way to give all the zombies you control Menace for the turn. Speaking of which, we also have Graph Harvest, an enchantment that gives our zombies Menace and letting us exile a creature card from our graveyard to make a 2/2 zombie token. And finally, Vizier of the Scorpion has you amass 1 when it enters, so in this deck it would just make a 1/1 zombie army, as this is the only amass card in this deck, but it also gives zombie tokens you control Death Touch. But with that, let's move on to our card advantage spells. Starting with some sorceries, with Sign in Blood having a target player draw 2 and then lose 2 life, Read the Bones having you scry 2, draw 2, then lose 2 life, and Pact of the Serpent having you choose a creature type and having a target player draw X and lose X life, with X being the number of creatures they control of that chosen type. Then we have Village Rites and Corrupted Conviction, 1-drops that draw 2 cards after you sack a creature, with Nasty End and Eviscerator's Insight doing the same for 2 mana, though the former has you draw 3 if the sack creature was legendary, and the latter having Flashback. Plumb the Forbidden has you draw a card and lose 1 life, though you can sack 1 or more creatures while casting it, and you copy the spell for each creature sacked that way. Fell Stinger is a 3/2 with Death Touch and Exploit, where you can sack a creature as it enters the battlefield, and if it exploits a creature while it's entering, a target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Then for draw across turns, we have Ravenous Amulet and Vampiric Rites, which lets you sack a creature to draw a card, the former also getting a soul counter, though it can only be activated at sorcery speed, and can be sacked to have each opponent lose life equal to the number of soul counters on it. Shadowheart, Dark Justiciar lets you sack another creature to draw X cards, with X being that creature's power. Ayara, First of Locthwain, has each opponent lose 1 life and yourself gain 1 whenever Ayara or another black creature, such as our zombies, enters the battlefield under our control, while letting you sack a black creature to draw a card. Idol of Oblivion simply lets you tap it to draw a card, provided you created a token that turn. And Phyrexian Arena simply has you draw a card and lose 1 life at the beginning of your upkeep. And finally, while technically not draw, Into the Pit lets you look at the top card of your library at any time, and lets you cast spells from the top of your library by sacking a non-land permanent in addition to its other costs, effectively extending our hand into the top of our deck. But now let's move on to our interaction spells to help deal with what our opponents are cooking up. Starting with Doomblade and Go for the Throat to destroy a target non-black and non-artifact creature, respectively, and Infernal Grasp, which simply destroys a target creature and has you lose 2 life. Feed the Swarm lets us destroy a target creature or enchantment, though it's sorcery speed and we lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. And then Final Vengeance and Eaten Alive let us exile a target creature, though the former has a sack a creature or enchantment, and the latter sacking a creature or paying 4 extra mana, but it also gives you the option to exile a target planeswalker instead. Consuming Corruption deals X damage to a target creature or planeswalker while you gain X life, with X being the number of swamps you control. And Tragic Slip gives a target creature -1/-1 until the end of the turn, or -13/-13 instead if a creature had died that turn. While Defile gives a target creature -1/-1 until the end of the turn for each swamp you control. Stronghold Assassin can be tapped while sacking a creature to effectively Doomblade a target creature. And finally, for a couple of wipes, we have Decree of Pain, destroying all creatures and having you draw a card for each creature destroyed that way, though it could be cycled away for a Weenie's wipe. And Mutilate, which is basically sorcery speed Defile for all creatures, giving them -1/-1 for each swamp you control. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. Of which we only have a few non-basics, starting with Myriad Landscape, which does enter the battlefield tapped, but can be sacked to tutor 2 of our swamps onto the battlefield tapped. Barren Moor, which we can cycle away quite cheaply if we draw it when we would prefer something else. And then we have Mortuary Mire, which can let us put a target creature from our graveyard onto the top of our library. And aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 32 basic swamps. And now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing for just under $45 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as it's a list price, it isn't including costs such as shipping. Now, before I close out this video, I would like to mention a handful of cards that you may wish to consider if you're wanting to start upgrading or iterating on this deck. To start, some of the haste-granting footwear, namely Swiftfoot Boots, Lava Spur Boots, and Lightning Greaves, could be quite useful in this deck, as we could use them to get an extra swing off with our large creatures before they're ultimately sacked. Or alternatively, each of them also gives a form of protection, which might be nice to have on our commander. Just note that with Lightning Greaves, Shroud will make it so that you'll need to equip them onto something other than the creature that you want to sack, likely just re-equipping them onto Gisa, after we've swung, since we wouldn't be able to target that creature otherwise. Reanimate would be an excellent addition or alternative spell for getting our big boys out of the yard. And some permanents that let us untap a creature could be great for growing our army of zombies. Notably, Patriarch Seal, acting as both a mana rock and a way to untap Gisa. Mage Right Stone for untapping on the cheap. Puppet Strings also doing this but at higher mana costs, though it can also be used to tap a creature down. And Sting the Glinting Dagger, which can also give haste, but more importantly, it untaps its equipped creature at the beginning of each combat, so you could theoretically do a lot of untapping and sacking with this on Gisa. Imp's Mischief would be a great piece of interaction as a counterspell on black. Witch's Cottage as another land that could let us dig a creature out of our graveyard. Graveborn Muse could give you a ton of draw in this deck, though I feel like it's playing with fire a bit, as in some ways, it might also be too effective and drain our life or library a bit hard, as we draw X and lose X life at the beginning of our upkeep, with X being the number of zombies we control. Corrosive Mentor would make attempting to block our horde of zombies very unsavory, as this gives our black creatures Wither, where they deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. And while I could probably go on for quite a while longer, the last card I'd like to mention for the sake of brevity is Shepherd of Rot, which can be tapped to make each player lose 1 life for each zombie in play. Could be useful to lower life totals quite quickly depending on the board state, but like Graveborn Muse, it could also be a danger to ourselves to an extent. Regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider dropping it a like, and maybe sub to the channel if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.